One of the most influential composers of all time stands when music history was between eras, and he wrote his best work while deaf. I'm the classical nerd, and today we're talking about Ludwig van Beethoven. Beethoven was born in Bonn in December of 1770. His father was a man named Johann, and this guy was not nice. He was a serial abuser and alcoholic, and it's a wonder that his kids turned out as well as they did. He was a man of minor but useful musical talent, and he was hampered as much by his vices as by his social status, so he wanted to live on through his kids. As soon as his son showed any kind of musical aptitude, Johann put him through training of the utmost rigor, scolding and often beating the poor kid for improvising on his violin instead of diligently practicing the repertoire he was given. As soon as Ludwig outgrew Johann's ability to teach, he was sent off to the local organist Christian Gottlieb Nefer, who introduced the young Beethoven to the works of Johann Sebastian Bach. But Johann still had a great meddling interest in his son, and they took off on a road trip, barnstorming houses of nobility to showcase young Ludwig's talent, and it was a moderate success until they arrived in Vienna. Now, at this point, Vienna was one of the world's great cultural capitals, but ever since Mozart, they had become completely apathetic to any kind of young musical talent. If you were a child prodigy and you went to Vienna, chances are the nobility just didn't care. And that's what happened to Beethoven. By now, Beethoven had managed to make a bit of a name for himself, even if the Vienna trip didn't go exactly as his father had planned. As he grew older, he made important connections in the musical world and even took over the family's finances. He was now well established enough as a pianist and composer to go study and make a name for himself in Vienna, and he wanted to study with Mozart. And so launched for Vienna, and then Mozart died while he was on the way. So he decided, well, my second choice is Mozart's sometime teacher, Franz Joseph Haydn. Now, Haydn was getting up there in years, and he was being weighed down by the rigors of social activity and fulfilling more commissions than any one human could possibly hope to fulfill. And while Haydn acquiesced to Beethoven's request for counterpoint lessons, Haydn actually didn't have the time to correct them properly. And so Beethoven, realizing this, went to someone else behind Haydn's back in order to actually get counterpoint lessons. By this point, Beethoven was really starting to get himself and his music out into the musical world, taking over from the mantle of Mozart. He sucked in all the musical influences of his era, and his early works show that. For example, his first piano concerto exemplifies textbook concerto form. He took the forms of his peers and molded and shaped them over the course of his entire career into something entirely his own. Now, Beethoven was not a nice person to know. He was slovenly, he was irritable, he never outgrew his rough provincial manners, and statistically speaking, he probably also smelled bad. He got into huge fistfights with not one, but two of his brothers, one over publication rights, and the other because Beethoven thought he'd married a prostitute. Actually, he thought that both of his brothers had married prostitutes, but he only got into a fight with one of them over it. Ludwig himself never married, but he fell hopelessly in love with lady after lady above his social status, dedicating piece after piece to women with whom he never really had a chance. God, he smelled bad. At this point, Beethoven was really beginning to do some radical things with form and structure. Radical! His famous Moonlight Sonata starts slowly, which is really weird considering most sonatas started off with a movement of at least reasonable quickness. And it uses strained harmonies nearly unprecedented for the time. His third symphony, the Eroica, stretched classical symphonic form just about as far as it would go. And his fifth symphony was so groundbreaking in so many ways that it's hard to encompass them all. Around 1798, he first experienced hearing loss. To a musician, this might as well have been a death sentence. While he is best known today as a composer, no one in his era had ever made a career solely off of freelance composition. Composers were either tied to courts, or they were able to, like Mozart was able to do, make a living freelance by primarily being a pianist. If unable to hear, Beethoven would be forced to churn out more music than anyone thought humanly possible. While his eventual deafness and his triumph in its face are quite literally the stuff of legend, to this day, no one really knows what caused him to go deaf in the first place. What we do know is that the hearing loss was gradual, which must have been torturous. In fact, we know it was torturous because of an unsent letter known as the Heiligenstadt Testament, a letter in which Beethoven openly contemplated suicide until eventually convincing himself he had more to do on Earth. So he pressed on. He didn't go fully deaf until around 1813 and used ear horns and specially built pianos to try to combat the degradation. Through all of this, he composed ever more groundbreaking music. He threw away convention after convention of the classical era and looked back to Bach as much as he looked forward to Boogie Woogie. Beethoven managed to make it as a freelance composer, although not without the help of generous patrons who gave him lots of money and supported him. These generous stipends kept him financially afloat, but they didn't make him any less aggravating to their royal sensibilities. True to form, Beethoven was crude and unkempt until the end. His late life was filled with as much sadness as triumph. Beethoven's brother Karl died and he became embroiled in a huge custody battle for his son, also named Karl, but this one with a K. The young Karl disliked his uncle for a good reason, because he was very protective and controlling of him to just an extreme amount. Beethoven limited Karl's access to his mother because he believed her to be an immoral lowlife. He had never quite forgiven his brother for marrying a woman who had had a child out of wedlock, and the battle was on. Today, this kind of custody battle might be resolved within 30 minutes on Judge Judy. Back then, this was a big deal. Beethoven went as far as to insinuate that the Van in his name was similar to the von, which connotes nobility amongst German-speaking peoples. For Karl, it was a living hell from which he attempted to escape by shooting himself on the head. Fortunately, the pistol misfired, so he was injured but not dead. He was reconciled to his mother in the hospital and joined the military to get away from Beethoven. This is not to say that Beethoven was a bad person. He genuinely thought he was doing something right by his family. Also, we gotta remember that his only role model in this area was his father, who we have already established as being a terrible human being. Enough about his life. Beethoven, now fully deaf, entered the late period of his career. Most of his late output come in the form of string quartets, which are collectively known as the late quartets, because sometimes music historians are just really inventive with their names. These push the string quartet medium to insane heights, both compositionally and technically. Many musicians consider them horrifically unplayable. Where most string quartets were 4 movements, Beethoven said, I'll write one with 6. Where violinists dared to play, Beethoven said, you should play higher than that. But the quartets decide his final symphony, the Ninth Symphony, or the Choral Symphony, was undoubtedly his late masterpiece. He flipped the order of the middle movements, tuned the timpani in octaves, which is actually a bigger deal than it sounds, and introduced a chorus and soloists singing a setting of Schiller's poem Ode to Joy in the final movement. And that's not even touching on the unprecedented harmony he used. Radical! However, he insisted on conducting the premiere, and only the efforts of the concertmaster saved the performance from becoming a complete disaster. He was actually still conducting when the piece concluded, and an assistant had to turn him around so he could appreciate the unprecedented adulation he was receiving. He tried to suppress the fact that he was going deaf for long enough, but eventually the public found out, and most of the people in the audience knew. It was essentially an open secret, and they loved him all the more for it. At this point, Beethoven's health was failing him. Although he did continue to compose, some scholars have actually pieced together what they believe to be bits of a 10th symphony, but he was worse and worse off every day, eventually becoming bedridden. According to legend, he died on a peal of thunder. His cause of death is the cause of some conjecture, but was probably cirrhosis of the liver because, like his father, Beethoven liked to drink a little too much. Not radical. It is impossible to overstate the kind of impact Beethoven has had on composers throughout history. Scores of great composers are on record as being intimidated by the ghost of Beethoven, and feeling like trying to write anything after his late great masterpieces is tantamount to some kind of heresy. Johannes Brahms was one of these composers who thought that writing any symphony after Beethoven was an impossible challenge. It took him 20 years to write his first symphony, and when it finally came out, everyone just called it Beethoven's 10th. We know Beethoven for a body of music that has entered the public knowledge, but we admire him more for what he represents. He made beauty despite desperation and pain, and he created something that, at least in this life, he was never able to truly appreciate.